In a small, secluded village, there stood an antique shop known for its rare and curious items. The shop was owned by Mr. Aldridge, an elderly man with a knack for finding the most unique artifacts. Among his treasures was an ornate, full-length mirror that had been passed down through generations. It was said to have once belonged to a reclusive duchess who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Lena, a young woman new to the village, stumbled upon the shop one crisp autumn afternoon. She was immediately drawn to the mirror. It had an intricate gold frame adorned with delicate carvings of vines and flowers. The glass, though slightly tarnished, reflected a timeless beauty. Despite a strange feeling that washed over her as she gazed into it, she decided to buy the mirror to add a touch of elegance to her cottage. From the moment she placed it in her bedroom, strange occurrences began. At first, it was just whispers, soft and indistinct, echoing through the room at night. She dismissed them as the house settling or her imagination. But soon, the whispers grew louder and more persistent, always starting around midnight. One particularly unsettling night, Lena was jolted awake by a loud thud. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, and noticed that the room was colder than usual. The mirror stood in the corner, casting an eerie reflection in the moonlight. She squinted, trying to discern what was wrong. As she stared into the mirror, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A shadowy figure stood behind her in the reflection. She spun around, but her room was empty. Terrified, she tried to rationalize what she had seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or her groggy mind playing tricks on her. But the next night, the figure returned, clearer and closer. This time, she could make out its features. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered gown, with hollow eyes and a sinister grin. Lena's reflection seemed to warp and twist as the figure moved closer, reaching out a bony hand. Determined to uncover the truth, Lena began researching the mirror's history. She learned that the duchess who owned it had been accused of witchcraft and had vanished without a trace. Locals believed her spirit was trapped in the mirror, cursing anyone who possessed it. Despite her fear, Lena was skeptical of these old legends. She decided to confront the apparition. One night, she stood before the mirror with a flashlight and a voice recorder, hoping to document any supernatural activity. As the clock struck midnight, the temperature in the room plummeted. The whispers began, louder and more coherent. Lena heard her name being called, repeatedly and insistently. The reflection of the woman appeared again, but this time, she was not alone. Dozens of shadowy figures filled the mirror, their eyes glowing with malevolence. Lena's reflection began to change, her image twisting into a grotesque version of herself, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. She tried to look away but found herself unable to move. The figure in the mirror stepped closer, pressing her hand against the glass. A crack appeared, spreading like a spider web. From the crack, dark, tendril-like shadows emerged, wrapping around Lena and pulling her towards the mirror. She struggled, but the shadows were too strong. Her screams echoed in the room, but there was no one to hear them. With a final, desperate cry, she was pulled into the mirror. The crack sealed itself, and the room fell silent. The next morning, the villagers noticed that Lena had not been seen since the previous day. Concerned, they went to her cottage and found it eerily quiet. The mirror stood in the corner, perfectly intact. But if one looked closely, they could see Lena's terrified face trapped behind the glass, her mouth open in a silent scream. The antique shop remained open, and Mr. Aldridge continued to sell his curious items. The mirror was eventually returned to him, as no one could bear to keep it. He placed it back in the shop, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to be drawn to its beauty. And so, the curse of the mirror lived on, claiming victim after victim, their spirits forever trapped in the glass, joining the chorus of whispers that echoed through the night. Willow House, an old mansion on the outskirts of town, had been abandoned for decades. It was rumored to be haunted by the ghost of its previous owner, a wealthy widow named Eleanor, who had died under mysterious circumstances. The mansion was a subject of local legends and ghost stories, drawing curious thrill-seekers and paranormal enthusiasts to its decaying halls. A group of friends, eager for a thrill, decided to spend the night in Willow House. They were avid fans of ghost hunting shows and had brought cameras, recording equipment, and a Ouija board, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. As they approached the mansion, the setting sun cast long shadows across its facade, giving it an ominous appearance. The group consisted of Mark, the skeptic, Lisa, the believer, Jake, the tech enthusiast, and Emma, the storyteller. As they crossed the threshold, the air inside the mansion felt thick and heavy. Dust covered every surface, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the air. They set up their equipment in the grand parlour, where they believed they had the best chance of encountering a spirit. Hours passed with nothing unusual happening. The friends began to relax, convinced that the stories were just myths. Mark, ever the skeptic, laughed at the idea of ghosts. "See? There's nothing here. Just an old creepy house," he said, leaning back in his chair. Suddenly the temperature in the room dropped, and a chill ran down everyone's spine. Emma noticed a figure standing at the top of the grand staircase. It was a woman in a long white dress, her face obscured by a veil. She seemed to glide down the stairs, moving silently towards them. The friends froze in fear, unable to believe their eyes. The figure stopped in front of them and lifted her veil. Her face was gaunt and pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into their souls. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a chilling, guttural sound that echoed through the room. Panic set in as the friends tried to escape, but the doors and windows seemed to have sealed shut. The ghostly figure raised her hand, and the friends felt an invisible force pushing them back. One by one, they were lifted off the ground and thrown against the walls, their screams echoing through the house. Desperate, Lisa grabbed the Ouija board and tried to communicate with the spirit. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. The planchette moved rapidly across the board, spelling out, "Leave." The friends scrambled to gather their equipment, but the ghostly figure blocked their path. Jake, thinking quickly, pulled out his camera and began taking pictures. The flash seemed to momentarily disorient the spirit, giving them a chance to run. They raced through the dark hallways, the sounds of their footsteps and heavy breathing filling the air. The ghostly whispers grew louder, chasing them through the mansion. They reached the front door, but it wouldn't budge. Mark threw his weight against it, and finally, it gave way. They stumbled outside, gasping for breath. The cold night air felt like a relief after the oppressive atmosphere inside the house. As they regrouped, they realized that Emma was missing. Panic set in once more as they called out her name, but there was no response. Reluctantly, they knew they had to go back inside to find her. With flashlights in hand, they retraced their steps, the fear growing with each passing moment. In the grand parlour, they found Emma standing before the fireplace, her eyes vacant. The ghostly figure stood beside her, whispering in her ear. "Emma!" Lisa shouted, rushing towards her friend. But as she reached out, an invisible force knocked her back. The spirit turned towards them, her eyes filled with anger. "You cannot leave," she hissed, her voice echoing through the room. "You belong to the house now." Jake, determined to save Emma, pulled out the camera again and began taking pictures. The flash disoriented the spirit once more, and Emma snapped out of her trance. The friends grabbed her and ran towards the exit, the whispers turning into screams of rage. They burst through the front door and into the night, not stopping until they reached their car. As they drove away, the mansion loomed behind them, its windows dark and foreboding. They had escaped, but they knew they would never forget the terror they had experienced. The next day, the townspeople found the friends outside Willow House, unconscious and battered. They had no memory of what had happened, but they all bore the same mark on their foreheads, a single, bloody fingerprint. Willow House remained abandoned, a place of fear and mystery, and the ghost of Eleanor continued to haunt its halls, waiting for the next group of thrill-seekers to wander into her domain. Deep in the heart of an ancient forest, there was a clearing known as the Whispering Woods. The locals avoided it, believing it to be cursed. It was said that anyone who ventured into the clearing after dark would never return. The stories told of eerie whispers, shadowy figures, and a presence that watched from the darkness. Ethan, a young journalist looking for a scoop, decided to investigate the Whispering Woods. He dismissed the tales as mere superstition and ventured into the forest with his camera and notebook. He was determined to debunk the myths and write an article that would put the rumors to rest. As he walked deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around him, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The path was narrow and overgrown, and the air grew colder the further he went. Despite the chill, Ethan pressed on, his curiosity outweighing his fear. He reached the clearing just as the sun set. The air grew thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the faint sound of whispers. Ethan strained to hear the words, but they were too soft and indistinct. He took out his camera, hoping to capture something on film. As he snapped pictures, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. He felt a cold breeze brush past him, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He turned around, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the ground beneath him began to tremble, and he heard a low, rumbling growl. Before he could react, the earth opened up, and dark, shadowy figures emerged. They were humanoid, but twisted and deformed, with glowing red eyes and sharp, claw-like fingers. Ethan tried to run, but the shadows moved faster, surrounding him and cutting off his escape. The whispers became deafening, filling his mind with incomprehensible words that drove him to the brink of madness. The shadows closed in, their cold fingers wrapping around him and pulling him into the darkness. His screams echoed through the forest, but there was no one to hear them. Desperately, Ethan fought against the shadows, trying to break free. He stumbled and fell, his camera flying out of his hands. It landed a few feet away, its lens cracked but still operational. Ethan crawled towards it, hoping to capture one last image that might explain what was happening. As he reached for the camera, a shadowy figure loomed over him, its red eyes glowing with malice. It reached out and touched his forehead, and Ethan felt a searing pain. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with dark thoughts and terrible images. He knew he was losing his sanity, but he couldn't stop it. With a final desperate effort, he grabbed the camera and took a picture. The flash illuminated the clearing for a brief moment, revealing the true nature of the shadows. They were the souls of those who had ventured into the Whispering Woods before him, twisted and corrupted by the curse. Their faces were contorted in agony, their eyes filled with despair. The figure stepped back, and the whispers suddenly stopped. The shadows began to recede, and the clearing returned to its eerie silence. Ethan lay on the ground, gasping for breath. He knew he had to get out of the woods before the curse claimed him too. He stumbled to his feet, clutching the camera, and began to make his way back to the village. The path seemed longer and more treacherous than before, but he pushed on, driven by the need to escape. As he reached the edge of the forest, he collapsed, exhausted and terrified. The next morning, a group of hikers found Ethan lying at the edge of the woods. He was delirious and covered in scratches, clutching his camera like a lifeline. They took him to the local hospital, where he was treated for his injuries. Ethan tried to explain what had happened, but his story was met with skepticism. The locals, however, knew the truth. They had warned him about the Whispering Woods, but he hadn't listened. Now, he was just another victim of the curse. The pictures on his camera revealed only darkness and blurry shapes, nothing that could prove his story. But Ethan knew what he had seen, and he would never forget the terror of that night. He left the village soon after, vowing never to return. The Whispering Woods remained a place of fear and mystery, its secrets hidden in the shadows, and the whispers continued to echo through the trees, calling out to those who dared to enter, luring them into the darkness, never to return.